morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Joanna. I'm a policy officer in the unit dealing with company law and corporate governance in Directorate General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission. And it's my pleasure today to be a moderator for this important panel devoted to fiduciary duties. I don't have to, I think, insist and explain why it is important. It is, of course, obvious that the way that the duties of company directors are formulated and are understood by these directors, of course, has a huge impact on how companies are governed, how they conduct their business. And in the same way, the way that institutional investors understand their fiduciary duties towards their beneficiaries has, of course, a huge impact on how the whole financial markets function, and then in turn on how companies can conduct their business. So, of course, it's a very important subject, and it is important to discuss this topic. So I would like to welcome the panelists. Mrs. Beate, who is professor at the University of Oslo, Mr. George Dallas, Policy Director at International Corporate Governance Network, and Eric Holterhues, Head of Sustainable and Responsible Investment at Triodos. And I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves a little bit more when they will speak. So as you have seen in the agenda of the conference, our aim is to discuss a number of questions. So first, concerning fiduciary duties of directors, what obligations should corporate directors have to consider environmental and social matters? And what is the best method to ensure that corporate directors properly consider these long-term factors, and in particular environmental and social issues, in discharging their duties? And second, concerning institutional investors, the questions which have been formulated are the following. Are the duties of institutional investors sufficiently clear to meet the long-term needs of beneficiaries? And could the law, or maybe even should the law, provide more guidance? From my perspective, I could maybe suggest that we could maybe concentrate on these two, I think, most important players, directors and institutional investors, but that we should also bear in mind that the perspective can be broader. Beyond corporate directors and institutional investors, we can actually look at different persons that play a role in the investment chain, such as, for example, asset managers, brokers, analysts, investment consultants, credit rating agencies, proxy advisors. So what are their duties? Are their duties also sufficiently clear, and do their duties allow them to consider ESG issues? I would like the panelists to also comment on the recommendation of the Roundtable on Corporate Governance for a Changing World. I will not read them out aloud because you have them here in your small folders. So they are on page 6 and 7 and 8. The recommendations start on page 7. So they are basically 3 sets of recommendations for corporations and their directors, to how they can incorporate long-term considerations, and in particular ESG, environmental and social issues, in their duties, in their business strategy, in their corporate governance and risk management. Then there are there are recommendations for institutional investors, how they can integrate long-term outlook, ESG consideration and engagement in their investment strategies. And third, there are some recommendations for policymakers to clarify the content of fiduciary duties with respect to some specific environmental and social issues, and also recommendations to clarify the role of not only directors and investors, but also asset managers and proxy advisors. Before giving the floor to the panelists, I would like to say some words about the public consultation on long-term and sustainable investment that already Richard Howitt referred to. So this consultation has been conducted by the Commission, has closed in March this year, end of March this year. And we hope that we will be able to publish the results soon. And of course, I will very much encourage you to look at the results of this consultation, because in our view, they are quite interesting. So we have received around 90 responses, very substantive. very detailed, and although they are maybe not completely new, I think, because the discussion, the debate goes on for a number of years, I think that they gave us a lot of insight into some specific topics. So I would really invite you to check from time to time on the website of the DG Just, because we will publish, hopefully, this feedback statement from the consultation soon. The whole objective of the consultation was to gather information about how institutional investors and asset managers integrate environmental, social, and governance issues into their investment strategies. So to have a mapping, what is the current state of play, and what are the obstacles of whatever nature that can prevent them from doing this in a proper manner. The idea was also to gather some best practices. So we have received a wealth of responses, quite a lot of examples of good practices, and also some examples of areas where basically there are no good practices yet, because the consultation was quite detailed and quite really pushing far. And I would say altogether the consultation shows that there is really now a broad consensus that ESG issues are important for investors and they need to be considered. But in practice, it is still not the case. ESG issues are still not sufficiently taken into account by mainstream investors. So there is a growing awareness about the importance of issues. And in the last 10 years, there has been a very important development, but it's still not enough. And the financial markets still predominantly focus on short term. And there were several elements that have been raised in particular. I will not, of course, give you all the details, but maybe some elements to mention. So, of course, participants raised the problems with the ESG information that is disclosed by companies. The problem is not as such the availability of information, because the information is available. Information from company, information from different service provider, but more whether this information is sufficiently comparable, reliable, and whether investors can use it in an easy way. There is a problem with the whole risk assessment approach in the financial sector. The risk assessment methodologies that are predominantly used are not necessarily adapted to analysis of long-term risk, are not necessarily forward-looking. And so there is need actually to invent completely new risk methodologies. The incentives of different players in the investment chain are not necessarily also well aligned with long-term objectives. And this is not only the case for institutional investors or asset managers, but also other players such as brokers, investment consultants. We asked some questions about, in general, the role of these different providers in the chain, such as investment consultants, brokers, research providers, credit rating agencies. And there again, although there is a growing numbers of specialized providers, agencies, the mainstream ones really should still do better, still do not pay sufficiently strong attention to ESG issues. As to fiduciary duties of institutional investors and asset managers, we have also asked a specific question about this, and the responses show that in the respondents' view, this conception of fiduciary duty is still used by some, probably not only very few, as an excuse, actually not to properly consider ESG factors in investment decisions or in investment advice. So the responses confirm what we know already from some time from different studies that has been conducted under the auspices of UNEP-FI, but also European Commission. These all studies confirm basically that there is no contradiction between fiduciary duties and considering ESG, that not necessarily it is well allowed within the fiduciary duties of institutional investors to take into account ESG considerations, and it's even required to some extent to consider material ESG issues, because this is something that, if not properly considered, can be actually have very clear negative financial impact. So there is clear room to include ESG issues, but also respondents said that there are still these outdated conceptions of fiduciary duties, these conceptions that really reduce fiduciary duties to uniquely short-term profits that are still alive, that are still present, and that there is probably need to do something about these outdated conceptions. And there have been two sorts of suggestions formulated by the responses. One is for the regulators somehow to clarify this duty, to really exclude these outdated duties and to really explicitly say, yes, fiduciary duty of institutional investors and asset managers allows them to consider ESG issues. This is not only about ethics, this is really something that is material that you can consider and you should to some extent consider. So this is why one way to go, one recommendation, but could be done through guidance, through recommendations, through legislations, that respondents had different suggestions. The second way, which is also something very important, what was already mentioned by John Kay, was that there is a need to educate the whole financial sectors. So there is need to really educate, raise their awareness, train employees of institutional investors and all the providers in the chain, inform boards. So there is also need to change the whole mindset of these financial system players to really convince them that they do not have to concentrate on short-term only, that they should not concentrate on short-term only, that they should be open to the factors that are maybe not in a very short-term horizon, but are important for long-term, that have actually impact on the business, on the investment. So this is a little bit the insight from our consultation. Now I would like to give the floor to the panelists, and of course I would ask you to comment a little bit on the recommendations of these roundtables, and also to present your views, what in your views should be done and could be done. So we'll start with Beate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very interesting introduction. It's great to be here and contribute to this very important discussion. I'm a professor of law at the University of Oslo. I've previously coordinated the international project Sustainable Companies, so this is a very fitting summit to be at. And I'm now presently coordinating the international research project Sustainable Market Actors for Responsible Trade, with acronym SMART. That's a Horizon 2020 project that will run from this year and until 2020. So I'm especially glad to have the opportunity to be here and talk about these very important issues. As was mentioned earlier today before the coffee break, it's great to see that there is so much more interest about these issues now. And at the same time, I think it's very important that we're not deceived and think that we who come to these kind of events represent the world of business and finance in general. But then most things would be solved already. So that there is still a very strong mainstream out there that is going in a different direction. And that direction is a very certain path towards a very uncertain future. So one of the few things we know for sure is that business as usual is not an alternative. And although there are some very laudable initiatives recently now from the European Union, one of which we just heard about, it seems to me that the EU has not generally recognized and therefore not dealt with the main barrier to sustainable companies, which is the social norm of shareholder primacy. This social norm, which I distinguish from the legal norm of shareholder value, has cannibalized the space that company law has left open to corporations and boards to find out in which direction and how they want to govern their company. And therefore, current efforts, including the otherwise very good non-financial reporting requirements from the EU, are insufficient. So we, in the opinion of the project that I ran from 2010 to 2014, where we did a multi-jurisdictional comparative analysis of the barriers and possibilities in company law and accounting law, we need a corporate law reform. Corporate law, the legislators need to take back the definition of what the purpose of the company is and what the duties of the directors are. because this has been taken over by this very short-term, narrow-minded shareholder primacy norm. And that corporate law reform should explicitly engage with the planetary boundaries that are the non-negotiable ecological limits that any economy in this world needs to stay within if we are not going to head towards that very uncertain future. And such a reform would provide the necessary link between the duty that the directors of the board feel that they have and what they're reporting on, because the problem now is this disconnect. When many board members perceive that they have a duty to maximize returns for shareholders, which is a legal myth, it's such a strong social norm that it has become a legal myth, then reporting on environmental and social impacts and human rights and tax and corruption, anti-corruption, all that, that's something that's on the side, and that is still how it is often treated. It's still the ugliest companies that use the most makeup. And such a reform would also provide a better basis for socially responsible investment, because how are investors or consumers or anybody supposed to know which companies are sustainable when we hardly know what's going on, because there are not the right incentives in place to report honestly. In fact, it is, I would put forward to you that it is irrational economically for a company to report honestly if its 999,000 competitors are reporting dishonestly. So, and a very important point also is the economic incentives for institutional investors. In spite of all the talk of long-term and sustainable investment, there are annual return requirements in place for fund managers, which makes it impossible for them to really take the generational long-term perspective that they are meant to have. So on that basis, turning then to the recommendations, I think they generally are very good. The first one, recommendations for corporations and their directors on page 7. I think this could be strengthened. I think it's important that it's connected to the business of the corporation and not whatever the corporation feels like doing to improve their image, but actually what the business is earning money on. How are they doing that? That's the interesting thing. And I think this could be strengthened, which is a part of our reform proposal, to have a duty for the directors to create a sustainable business plan, which is a long-term plan for how their business is, what they are going to do, what is their business about, and how are they going to do it. And that sustainable business plan should explicitly position the business within the planetary boundaries and relate to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Then there should be key performance indicators for what is quantifiable of that is verified by external experts. So it's a sustainable business plan, that's a requirement, and then key performance indicators that are verified so that we know from then on when the company reports every year that they're actually reporting on what is relevant for their company, because we've also done research that shows that even companies that report according to the Global Reporting Initiative, we've checked out first, what do the companies themselves and their stakeholders, I don't like the term, but let's just use it as, everybody interested generally, what they think is material. Companies say what's material, stakeholders say what's material, and there's quite a bit of overlap there. But do the companies report on what's material? No. They report on what's easy to report on, and they report on what makes them look good. And that's what we need to change by having key performance indicators that are connected to the business of companies, report on that, and then have verification of that, because it's time we start taking this reporting seriously. Otherwise, it's just bureaucratic extra work and a good basis for greenwashing. I'm putting it to a point, but that's the worst that companies that I'm speaking about, the extreme, is still a very important part of mainstream. And the second recommendation regarding the fiduciary duties of institutional investors, yeah, sure, all fine, but deal with shareholder primacy first and deal with the return requirements that are placed on institutional investors now. Otherwise, this increased engagement that we are now stimulating, encouraging institutional investors to do with the companies can actually, in the worst case, just reinforce shareholder primacy. And then the third recommendation for policymakers, yes, please, but do it generally and do it in a research-based way, and please don't load more requirements on companies that are not intended to be enforced or verified or followed up in any way, because that just leads to more regulatory apathy and regulatory opposition. When business feel that regulators just throw reporting requirements at them to make themselves look good, to give them a good feeling that they're doing something, but then because of pressure from business lobbyists, they don't include any verification or enforcement requirements, so nothing happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beate, for your ideas and interesting comments. My question would be, I deal with company law and corporate governance in the Commission for a while, and I've been engaged with some negotiations. I think Marcello has also known a little bit. Marcello Bianchi, who is sitting there, has also been, I think, quite active at some point in these negotiations. And what I think would like to maybe clarify, without entering into details of negotiations, that this is really, when it comes to core company law, to defining really the basis of company law, there is a great susceptibility of member states. That when we go to their core company, to the very foundation of company law, it's very, very difficult to bring, I think, different cultures, different settings on board and to reconcile them. So, do you have any, I think, ideas on, like how, for example, something can be achieved on a common basis, taking into account that the cultures, the approaches to company law, to corporate governance are so different that it's very difficult to reconcile these approaches.
Yeah, I totally understand that a great barrier to achieving change here. Perhaps that's the only possible a positive thing about Brexit. So if the UK leaves, then not because I don't love the UK, and I collaborate very well with lots of scholars from the UK, but one of the the shareholder primacy drive is a very Anglo-Saxon drive, which is informed by postulates from legal economic theories. So it's not even based on a proper analysis of legal economic theories, but it's postulates derived on them. So maybe we could use the opportunity, if the UK leaves, or even just company law after Brexit. Let's organize an event about that. And then we can discuss, I think a way forward also could be, and I understand that you working in the Commission have far too much to do, but so that I'm not expecting you to do it yourself, but perhaps to try to find people who you can engage with where the economic theories actually are today, because such a lot of legislative initiatives and such a lot of corporate governance initiatives are based on economic ideas that have been left behind by people who are working in the field, and they still inform the legislation. So if we could take a step back and start with a more open discussion, and I still see that there will still be problems that will be difficult to reconcile between the European countries, but I think the Commission can do it if they are willing to take the lead and address this in the context of climate change and the other environmental challenges that we are facing. There are 9 planetary boundaries that we need to respect. This is based on state-of-the-art natural science, and we are threatening 4 of them. So if we can put it in, not whether we want the German system or the Spanish system or the UK system, but because company law has been left out of this debate for far too long.
Thank you very much, Beate. So now I would like to give the floor to George.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. Thank you for coming, and I won't really introduce myself. I think my bio is in your program. I will say that in addition to my current job at ICGN, where I'm policy director, I've had a tenure at F&C as an asset manager, and then an even longer tenure at Standard & Poor's, so I guess I would present myself as a recovering rating agent. But maybe a short introduction about ICGN, International Corporate Governance Network. We're a membership body, and we are an investor-led membership body. We have various sorts of members, including corporations, which we very much encourage, but we're focusing on investors, and our investor members represent 26 trillion in assets under management. That's both shares and bonds and credit, so I think we need to think about creditors as well in this context in 45 countries around the world. Our ambition and our goal, we've been in existence since 1995, is to promote at the corporate level effective standards of corporate governance, but also increasingly, and this is what I'll be speaking to today, also responsible investment practices by investors very much with the long-term perspective. And our mission is to advance successful economies, efficient markets, and successful companies. And I would note to you, it's not to maximize the profits of institutional investors over the short term. I think the fiduciary responsibility of investors is a critical issue. It's one of ICGN's key policy priorities this year because we believe we're very much pushing shareholder rights because we believe that they're important, but we also think if shareholders are looking for rights, they also have responsibilities. And I think an earlier presentation this morning made a very quick reference to stewardship codes as something that's failed. I would challenge that, and we've just launched ICGN's global governance principles, global stewardship principles in the context of a growing focus on investor stewardship in markets around the world. This is cropping up in many markets. It's still a new idea. I would say it's not a proven idea. I'll have to grant that, but I think it's worth focusing on because it tries to codify and provide a framework for what investors should be doing. So I would recommend anybody who's interested in this to take a look at our global stewardship principles. It provides an overarching framework which we hope is going to be useful as markets begin to develop them for themselves or reconsider their own approaches to stewardship. And it has 7 broad principles. First, very much being investors' own corporate governance as an investment institution, but then dealing with traditional issues relating to developing policies, monitoring companies, engaging with companies, voting, acting as owners of companies. And I would, one of the fundamental 7 principles that we have, which is pertinent to this discussion, is ensuring that environmental and social factors are part of the investment process in terms of analyzing risk, in terms of engaging companies, in terms of how investors might use their rights in their voting process. So ESG, in our view, is just clearly a part of the framework, and it has to be part of what investors look at going forward. To some extent, for many investors, this is still aspirational. Many investors are taking this up. The focus is very much looking at long-term, promoting company success in the long term. The idea is investors are not just stock pickers. They need to be engaged with companies in their governance. They need to develop broader skills than valuation. They need to be in a position to engage with companies and try to use their ownership rights. And we'll talk about shareholder primacy in a bit, but shareholders do have ownership rights, and these need to be used responsible. But we would argue, again, this is still a work in process. I think that stewardship codes exist in many markets around the world. I think they're just getting going, and I think they deserve the benefit of the doubt, and we're certainly trying to promote them. But our first point of our first stewardship principle, as I mentioned a moment ago, was investors' own governance. And if they don't get their own governance correct, I think all of these other aspects of stewardship are potentially likely to fail. Having said that, I'd like to make 3 points to you. One is about purpose. I'd like to talk a little bit more about ESG. And then I'd also like to talk about systemic issues in addition to looking at companies on a micro basis. I think the idea of re-exploring the purpose of the company makes a lot of sense. If you do that, I think it also raises questions with regard to what is the purpose of finance more broadly. And then if you raise that question, you have to raise the question as to what is the purpose of investors, particularly institutional investors. And we're alert to the fact that shareholder primacy is under scrutiny, and that's an uncomfortable discussion for many in the investor community, and I think that this is something that we need to confront. We think we would agree at ICGN, and I think many of our members would also support the notions that were discussed this morning, that the purpose of a company certainly lies beyond trying to maximize short-term profits. It is very much serving customers, meeting unmet needs in a way that's in a responsible way with regard to all stakeholders, whether it's employees, whether it's customers, whether it's communities, or anybody affected by companies on a social basis, because I think increasingly we're beginning to understand in the context of self-interest that for companies that don't do this, they may not be that sustainable themselves. So the purpose of finance, you could argue, is ultimately to think about the extreme ends of the asset chain, to try to link the providers of finance, which are long-term savers, with the users of finance, which are companies, to try to create value, to try to generate wealth in a sustainable way. And if we look at this, the purpose of investors needs to facilitate this. I think our focus it's difficult sometimes to ignore the short term, but we have to also recognize that what our main objective is as investors, again, is not shareholder maximization, but it is to create sustainable returns for investors and beneficiaries. And for institutional investors, let's just not forget, I would suspect everyone in this room is a beneficiary, and probably in some shape or form through membership in some pension plan, perhaps an insurance policy, or even your long-term savings that you're doing through asset managers. So the issue is, at the end of the day, what we need to focus on is ensuring that the beneficiaries at the end of the chain are achieving objectives. And to some extent we talked about companies make the goal our goal is to make money for our beneficiaries, our pensioners, but it has to be in a sustainable way. And I think once you do introduce the sustainable argument into the equation, then that brings in a lot of questions with regard to purpose, shareholder primacy, and the like. ESG, this is linked to this debate, and as I said, this is one of the 7 principles of ICGN's global stewardship principles, very much linked to trying to promote a long-term focus in companies. I think we recognize as investors that companies must, and their boards must understand the environmental and social impacts that both create and destroy value, and investors need to support this, even if in the short term it may not always generate short-term results. This is important in the context of risk assessments, and it's important in the context of engaging with companies. And I would also endorse the legal point that was made earlier, and for those who haven't seen the Principles of Responsible Investment last year published an excellent study re-examining the legal foundations for looking at ESG in a fiduciary responsibility context. And I think if anybody's read the report, I think you'd find it very convincing. And I think we just need to, this is maybe part of the educational process that needs to take place with regard to just appreciating that ESG is interlinked to long-term success, and this is something that both companies and investors need to pay attention to. And what we do a lot is we engage with companies, our members engage with companies and their boards. And the types of things that we're doing at ICGN are trying to facilitate this dialogue, looking at issues that if you looked at ICGN's agenda 5 or 10 years ago, there's been a bit of a sea change. And some of the recent work that we're doing is relating to human rights from a governance perspective, looking at climate change in terms of what boards and investors need to be thinking about and aware of, looking at anti-corruption, which is a huge, huge issue in markets around the world. And it's critical for both companies and investors to understand that these issues, which I think a few years ago might have been put in some social responsible investment box, that's a false distinction. These issues are fundamental to a company's long-term sustainability and ultimately to the ability of institutional investors to generate sustainable returns for their clients. My last point, I'd just like to touch briefly on the issue of systemic issues. And and this is really looking at the integrity of stability of economies and financial markets at the macro level. A lot of corporate governance is looking at what individual companies are doing, and that's important, and that's work that we will continue with. But individual companies coming together as a group form a market, and we need to think about this in a sustainable, in a systemic context to try to promote long-term economic growth for economies that will provide stability to populations and including the beneficiaries of long-term investment. So we need to take a look at macro perspectives, which are critical in a long-term sense, and we need to balance investors' needs to generate returns. And if you look at the long-term systemic arguments, it's difficult not to. I think this is where shareholder primacy does come under question. Shareholders have a role to play, and they're an important piece of the equation, but they're not the only piece. And there has to be an understanding that stakeholders and just the social impact of companies as a whole is fundamental for us achieving long-term results for our beneficiaries, again, sustainable returns. And again, this is where environmental and social issues are fundamental. Again, climate risk, anti-corruption, human rights are key. Final point, I have not had a chance to read through this in every piece of detail, and I suspect that this is a subject for I think an afternoon panel. Most of these recommendations look very good. I would challenge the Section 7 long-term and sustainable investment, where they're suggesting differential ownership rights as a tactic to promote long-term and sustainable investment. We would challenge that. I don't think the evidence, I think, is lacking, and I think, in fact, there's more evidence that this may be problematic in terms of diminishing accountability of the controlling owners from their minority shareholders, and there's lots of examples as to how this can go bad. The intention is good, but there's limited evidence from our perspective that this actually promotes the type of long-term thinking that we all need. So that's a particular piece of the equation that we would challenge. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would give the floor now to Eric.
Yeah.
So you have a PowerPoint presentation.
I have a presentation.
This will to get maybe.
I have a presentation.
Is it possible to get some help for the presentation? Sorry. That we,
I see. Yeah. No, it's there. No.
It's there. Okay.
Is it that one?
Yeah, it's it.
No, you just press F5. F5.
So, thank you very much. I will respond on the recommendations by showing the example of Triodos Bank. So during my presentation, I also respond on certain recommendations of the group. So I work for Triodos Bank. We were established in 1980 by several bankers who said two things that, in my opinion, are still very important. They said we want to establish a bank that is transparent, that show investors and clients and the world what we do with money. And we want to do that because you have an awful lot of influence with money. And we want to invest money to make society a better society, to make society more sustainable. We speak about to give society a high quality of life. Along 3 ways, that's why we call Triodos, Greek for 3 ways. They said, and we're still saying, there are 3 things important for a sustainable society. That is preserving the earth. That's why we're active in organic farming, in renewable energy. How people cope with each other on the earth. That's why we're active in fair trade, in microfinance. And the development of each individual. That's why we're active in education, in healthcare, and in culture. So the earth, we and I, society, environment, and culture, that are the 3 main objectives of Triodos. So we see it as our fiduciary duty to add value to society, and of course, since we are a bank, also also to create financial performance and in a good risk framework. So our fiduciary duty is always both ESG and financial performance. And we do it in 3 entities, retail and business banking, private banking, and investment management. I will elaborate a little bit more on investment management. And we don't work with bonuses. So there isn't any incentive only to focus, because I think that's the problem with bonuses. We are not against bonuses, but the problem with bonuses is that their focus is only on certain aspects and not on, they don't have a holistic approach on, in our opinion, what a bank should do. And that is exactly what George said, to create value for society, not only financial performance, but also to add value when we speak about sustainability. In the session we had before, somebody asked, a sustainable business is this profitable, and why doesn't everybody is sustainable then? Well, that's a good question, because we actually rapidly grow the last 30 years. And actually more and more since the financial crisis, many investors, both institutional and retail investors, ask themselves, what is actually my bank doing with my money? Is it invested in a way that I can explain to my children? Is it invested in a way that is risk avoiding also, makes profit, and adds value to society? So we are actually quite popular all over Europe in the countries where we are in. When we speak about Triodos investment management, we manage 19 investment funds. 15 of them are, we call them, that is called alternative investment funds. So they invest in non-listed companies directly through equity or loans around certain areas. So we have investment funds around microfinance, investment funds around renewable energy, one investment fund that actually invests, the only one in the world, in culture. In cultural projects, since we find it important, since we find that culture really has an added value for a sustainable society, we also think we have to play a role in that. Also because of governments are decreasing subsidies in the culture area. And we have 4 investment funds that invest in listed companies that meet our very strict sustainable criteria. And here we also see that we are actually rapidly growing, more and more also in the field of institutional investors. So more and more pension funds, insurances, and also foundations ask themselves, how is my money invested? And more foundations, especially charity, ask themselves, is my money invested in a way that is not harmful, but also in a way that is mission related? So related to the mission of my charity. We find it important when we communicate to our investors that we not only communicate risk and performances and everything around compliance and so, but also the impact we have. So for example, with our renewable energy funds, we communicate the number of households that make use of renewable energy. Then our funds that invest in listed companies. So we have 4 funds, an equity fund, a bond fund, a mixed fund, and a pioneer fund. Also they grow rapidly all over Europe. And what we do is that we, I'll elaborate a little bit later on that, we screen listed companies on very strict sustainable criteria, but we also engage with them to make them even more sustainable. And we do it in 3 ways. We engage with them during our research process. We engage with them afterwards when they are in our universe on certain topics, together with other companies and NGOs and sustainable investors like ICGN. And also we vote on AGMs. And we are awarded on that throughout Europe, both on sustainability, the sustainability performances, but also on the financial performances. Because, and we are happy with that, because we say it is both ends. We have, when you want to be reliable as course, you have to make a financial performance, and you have to be sustainable. Of course, we also have benchmarks. So, for example, the equity fund, the benchmark of the equity fund is the MSCI World Index. We are outperforming the MSCI World Index since the establishment of the fund 15 years ago. But you can also question, that was one of my response to the recommendations, you can also question actually the performance of the MSCI World Index. Isn't that too high? Because the negative effects of non-sustainable companies is not incorporated in the performances. So, for example, their effect on environment, for example. So you can question. So we are outperforming the MSCI World Index, the index for non-sustainable companies, but you can actually question, isn't that performance a little bit too high? What we do in our research process when we screen companies on sustainability, we start with the MSCI World Index. We look at, do they have sustainable activities, or are they best in class within their sector? And then we add our minimum criteria, and out of that comes a sustainability universe. There are 45,000 companies listed. We end up with 300 companies that are meeting our very strict sustainable criteria, and we only invest actually in 70 companies in our equity fund. So it's very hard to find companies that are both sustainable and financial good. And what we do is, when we screen companies on sustainability, we look at their product, we look at the way the process, so the processes are to provide a product, and we also look at the precautionary principle. So some of the companies are in sectors where you say, well, you have to have a policy because on certain topics, because you are in a more or less dangerous field. For example, you are in a country which is it has a best government on environment. Do you have a policy on that to avoid environmental risk? And I said a very important part of our work is not only the financial side and the risk side, which is more and more important for investment managers, but also to engage with companies on sustainability. As said, during our research on certain topics and by voting. And we also communicate on that to our investors by our company engagement reports. Here you see some of the topics we had last year. We do a lot on tax transparency the last couple of years, because that's really an item, but also on board diversity, and since the climate conference, also on climate protection. So briefly, I think to respond on the recommendations, I think we really want to promote, as Triodos, make a conscious way of investing your money. So you, as individual investors, well, you also have power to change society, and we like to invest money in a more conscious way. The second thing is, I'm doubting actually of if although we are outperforming the benchmark of if the performance, and I think we have to question that also in the media, if the performances of non-sustainable companies is really good or maybe too high. And I'm a little bit doubting about regulation, because in my experience, you know, ugly companies use makeup a lot. You know, they are looking for loopholes. So more regulations, you come into a pitfall of even more regulations to avoid loopholes. But I think that always helps.
Thank you very much, Eric. So thank you very much to all for your movement and your interesting point of view, for these interesting highlights from all of you. So we agree, indeed. I think I assume that there is agreement between us that indeed I think there is a try to change this vision that short-term focus is really something to be considered at the expense of all other items. I think on this all of us agree. Then I think certain ideas between us maybe are different. I think you, Beate, you consider that the first thing is really to focus on the shareholders' primacy and to combat this myth of shareholder primacy. But I think George and Eric from investors' side also asked also to give a benefit of the doubt, as George said, to investors, and also to recognize that investors can play actually a very positive role. And I think, Eric, you showed us also a good example how investors can actually be have a very positive role and actually change the corporation into more positive. So I think we have to consider, I think, these issues, I think, as complementary. So I think we have to. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, sorry. So we have to consider, I think, this point of view as complementary. So we have to, of course, go away from certain understanding of indeed very short-term oriented shareholder interest as the only, I think, paradigm of company. I think we all agree about that. And we have also to recognize that investors can play a good role, and we have to also look for different ways in which investors can indeed improve their impact on how companies function. So I think, despite some differences of views, I think we all would like to indeed promote this objective. So now I would like to give the floor to the participants. So you are, of course, welcome to ask questions to the panelists. Yes, is there a microphone? Yes, so gentlemen in the first row, I think. Sorry. Gentlemen in the first row, I think the microphone should be coming now.
Raj Shamostram, a great panel. I think Beate made a really important point when she said that how this is framed is going to be critical. My sense is that the Commission and our community has misframed it for some time, and I think non-financial reporting is a perfect way to disengage the financial sector. If you tell them it's non-financial, then why the ... should they care? And I think Mark Carney has started to frame it in a much more interesting way, which is to link sustainability with the macro. And George was talking about the systemic. He's starting to link our low growth, no growth economies and a way around it. And I think this is another opportunity of the crisis that we're in, which is to speak to the condition, not to that kind of old, bland, third way kind of stuff. So I would really urge that. My question really relates to what regulators and governments can do. Clearly, governance and culture are the key, and the two big problems there are the conflicts of interest in the sector and the fact that bonuses, which are operating at 100, 200 or more % completely shape investment behavior. People do what they're well paid to do. This is obvious. So what can regulators to do? Well, one thing which we learned from the UK is that leaving investors to self-police their stewardship is a failed opportunity. They don't do it well. It's been taken away from investors to the FRC. What's the equivalent in other countries? And I guess my question would be, does the Eurosif Transparency Code, is it enough of a way forward? Could it be something that's mandated across Europe, or is it a bit of window dressing?
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is a question here on the in the fourth row, here in that side.
To tell you that we're running out of time.
Okay.
We should start lunch break at 1. So if you have a quick question, but maybe you can after follow up during lunchtime if you want.
Okay.
We have 1 hour and 15 minutes for lunch,
Okay.
Susanna. We have 1 hour and 15 minutes for lunch. Perhaps to give the audience a chance, we could just take 15 minutes.
In the conference room, we're going to have the lunch session as
Lunch.
well by Will Martin. That's the reason.
Okay.
Will Markdale from UNPRI is going to be hosting a session at lunch on principles of responsible investment.
Okay, cool.
On clarification of fiduciary duties. So what I would suggest is we bring it back to the panel to have a quick wrap up if there's anything burning. Grab lunch, we come back here, continue discussion. Will moderate that discussion and we'll pick up right where we left off. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but we just went a little bit closer to time and we have to get back on for the lunch sessions. So if we can just bring it back to you guys if there's anything quick we need to wrap it up.
Thank you very much. So maybe Beate, very quickly.
Yes,
I'm sorry
yes.
to the participants. We have started, I think, our panel a bit late indeed. So yeah.
Yes, deal with the bonuses and the share options, absolutely. Learn of the best alternatives, whether it's B Corps or Triodos or the ICGN, and find out how to mainstream that. And we definitely need smarter regulation. I agree.
George, sorry.
I would just say this is a journey. And I think investors, for the most part, are heading in the right direction. Not all of them are there yet. And I think it's a question of both investors and ultimately the trustees of asset owners to try to ensure that these values are cooked into the way that money is managed.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah, well, not much to add. Indeed, it's a journey. So, for example, I visit also some AGMs, and my colleague told me, once I visited an AGM a couple of years ago, 10 years before that, we were the only investor who asked questions about sustainability. 10 years later, the whole AGM was around sustainability, actually. And one of the questions we had, okay, you have a bonus, we maybe don't agree with that, but is also your sustainability goals incorporated in your bonuses? Well, you know, I think when you speak about the journey, they were a little bit surprised by that question, but I can imagine that over 10 years we have another discussion.
Thank you very much. So sorry for no time for questions. Thank you very much, and if we can take up the questions.